Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. This is the first part of a two-episode interview for the playlist The Italian Phenomenon. Fabio Zanfretta recounts the memories and experiences of living alongside his father, Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, the central figure in one of Italy's most famous UFO cases. Amid extraordinary family episodes, everyday tensions, and the impact of unexplained phenomena on domestic life, the emotions and perspective of someone who experienced the story from the inside emerge. When discussing the Zanfretta case, the narrative almost always begins on the night of December 1978. People talk about the patrol, the villa on the heights of Marzano di Torriglia, the frantic call to the operations center, the intervention of the Carabinieri. That's where the public story starts. But for Fabio Zanfretta, the story didn't start that night. It began years later, in a confused, fragmented, almost subterranean way. At the time of the first episodes, he was about a year and a half old, too young to remember. His sister, 3 years older, might have retained slightly clearer memories, but even for her the beginning remains vague. At home, the events were never openly discussed, not in front of the children. In the interview, Fabio clearly states that his father tried to keep them out of everything. He tried to exclude us, he explains. The most delicate conversations took place between his father and mother, often in another room, often in hushed tones. Yet, he adds, children perceive what is left unsaid. They sense changes in the atmosphere. His earliest memories date back to when he was around 9 or 10 years old. They are not linear memories. They are scattered images, a climate of tension, a father often absent, a worried mother, a few words overheard. Only much later would he connect these fragments to what had become a national case. By those years, the Zanfretta name was already circulating outside the home. It appeared on television, in newspapers, at conferences. For a child, however, the public dimension is secondary to the family one. Fabio doesn't recall the media impact itself, but he does remember how daily life changed. His father worked a lot. Night shifts, overtime, constant commitments. He did so much for us, he says. He recounts this not with bitterness, but as a matter of fact. His absence was partly due to work, partly due to what was happening. There was another hard-to-define sensation, the feeling that some topics could not be openly discussed at home. It wasn't an explicit ban, but an implicit boundary. When his parents lowered their voices or interrupted a conversation as soon as the children entered the room, the message was clear: there was something that must not be shared. Fabio describes these memories as flashes, small, isolated frames. Only as he grew older, reading articles, attending conferences, talking directly with his father, did he begin to fill the gaps between one image and the next. One aspect he emphasizes is the distance between how his father was perceived externally and domestic reality. In public, especially in the following years, Pier Fortunato Zanfretta was often presented as an almost epic figure, the ordinary man facing the unknown and confronting it. At home, however, Fabio also remembers fear. This is a central point in his account. The story didn't only bring media attention, but also confusion and unease. Fabio recalls that his father himself had no clear answers. He had no reassuring, interpretative key. He tried to understand, to make sense of it. For a child, seeing a parent in difficulty is destabilizing. It's not the object of the story, aliens, lights, entities, that matters most. It's the effect it has on family balance. Fabio also recalls the social dimension. At a certain point, the surname became recognizable. People knew. Some were curious, others ironic, others openly skeptical. Reactions were not always benevolent. Growing up, he often had to answer questions posed lightly or sarcastically. But in the early period, childhood confusion prevailed. There wasn't yet awareness of being inside one of Italy's most documented UFO cases. Rather, there was the perception that something in the house was not entirely normal. Fabio insists on one point. He never experienced the story as a film or an extraordinary adventure. He lived it as an element of instability, a constant background noise. When asked when he truly understood the magnitude of the events, he does not indicate a precise moment. He speaks of a gradual process. First, the voices heard by chance, then more explicit stories from his father, then reading books such as Reno Di Stefano's, then conferences he attended as an adult. Awareness builds over time. But the underlying emotions, the tension, uncertainty, the feeling of being observed or judged from the outside, take root in childhood. If the first period was marked by vague, fragmentary perceptions, in later years certain elements became more concrete in Fabio's memory. Among these, one of the most recurring concerns his father's periodic outings. In the interview, Fabio recalls that for a period his father was absent with a frequency that, in hindsight, seems regular. Not always on the same day, not with a rigid schedule, but roughly every 15 days. Sometimes at night. As a child, he wasn't given a detailed explanation. He knew his father worked, did shifts, could be called. But growing up, he began connecting these outings with what his father recounted publicly. The delivery of an object, the need to go to a precise location, the presence of a sort of non-human appointment. This is where the so-called box comes into play. Fabio does not claim to have examined it as scientific evidence. He does not describe it as an object studied in a laboratory. He speaks of it as part of his father's story, something that, in some way, entered family life. According to Pier Fortunato Zanfretta's accounts, he was entrusted with an unconventional object, a kind of container with an inner sphere and 12 symbols at the base. A device that supposedly needed to be activated or taken to certain locations to allow contact. Fabio does not dwell on technological aspects. He focuses on the effect the story had within the family. Knowing that his father was guarding something that could not be openly discussed, something that, according to him, did not belong to this world, was far from a neutral detail. He recalls that these outings were not taken lightly. There was evident tension. Sometimes his father appeared nervous before leaving. It wasn't the attitude of someone going for a stroll. It resembled someone who felt obliged. An important point in the interview concerns this sense of obligation. Fabio does not describe his father as enthusiastic or fascinated. He portrays him as someone undergoing a situation. If events occurred as recounted, these were not friendly encounters. There was no equal exchange. Rather, there was an imposition. This detail, in the son's account, changes the perception of the story. In public debate, the experience is often imagined as a form of election or privilege. Fabio, on the other hand, conveys the opposite idea, a burden. Nighttime outings were among the most delicate moments. The mother stayed awake. She did not always speak, but the anxiety was perceptible. For a child or teenager, noticing that a parent is not home can generate insecurity, even if the details are unknown. Fabio recalls that there were no fully reassuring explanations. There were generic phrases, attempts to normalize. But normality, in those moments, was hard to maintain. Over time, when he began attending some conferences with his father, he heard the public version of these appointments directly. He listened to descriptions of isolated places, hills, portals, luminous phenomena. He heard about an incident where, according to his father, a beam of light struck a hair, splitting it in two. These are stories that may appear incredible or symbolic to outsiders. For a son, however, the point is not to establish the physical plausibility. It's to understand why his father was involved in something so radical. Fabio does not claim to have found an answer. He emphasizes, instead, the difficulty of living with a story that cannot be fully verified but cannot be dismissed as fantasy either, because it produces real effects in daily life. Another element emerging in the interview is the gradual separation between the initial phase of the case, documented with colleagues, carabinieri, and reports, and the subsequent, more private phase. Periodic outings, the box, ongoing contacts belong to this second phase. Here the ground becomes more fragile. Skepticism increases, and the family finds itself more isolated. Fabio recounts that, growing up, he began asking more direct questions to his father. He did not always receive detailed answers, not out of hostile reticence, but because of character. Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, he says, is not a person who likes to analyze endlessly. He tells what he wants when he decides to. This created a certain distance over time, not an open conflict, but a space not completely filled. For a child, living with such a large and controversial story without access to a complete narrative can be frustrating. Yet Fabio expresses no resentment. Rather, he describes an equilibrium found over time. Night outings, the box, appointments. They became part of a family story that cannot be altered. The point, once again, is not to prove. It's to coexist. If the night outings represent the external dimension of the events, the episodes occurring inside the house are those that most deeply impacted Fabio's direct experience. In the interview, he recounts that one of the most destabilizing aspects was not so much the later stories about encounters, but what happened suddenly during ordinary moments. A meal, a conversation, a quiet evening. He describes a specific scene. He was between the living room and the kitchen. His parents were speaking normally. Suddenly, his father stopped, as if he had sensed something. He said a sentence that Fabio still remembers in meaning, if not in exact words. "Wait, I don't understand." He seemed to be listening. Not a voice audible to others, not an ambient sound. Something that, according to him, came from within or through a channel not shared. He remained motionless, focused, as if trying to translate a message in a language he did not fully master. Then, sometimes, he explained that he could not comprehend it. Other times he would get up and leave. Fabio emphasizes that these episodes did not have a spectacular scene. There were no sudden lights in the house, no objects moving. There was rather a change in his father's behavior. For a child or teenager, witnessing these sudden transformations is destabilizing. The adult figure, which represents stability, stops, freezes, seems connected to something invisible. Another recurring moment occurred during meals. The family sat at the table. Conversation proceeded normally. Suddenly, the father would stiffen. Silence. A fixed gaze. Then brief phrases, sometimes incomprehensible to those listening. Fabio recounts that these episodes did not always lead to an immediate exit. Sometimes they concluded with a return to apparent normality, but they left a mark on the atmosphere. It is important to note that, in his account, Fabio does not interpret these events exclusively in extraterrestrial terms. He does not present them as evidence. He describes them as observed facts, behaviors he witnessed. There is also the episode recounted by his mother and referenced in the interview, the night they were playing cards on the bed. A simple domestic moment. The father's expression changed. He told her to turn over and sleep. He insisted. She obeyed, then turned again and saw in his eyes something she described as different, an unusual brightness. Fabio reports this story without embellishment. He does not add visual details, does not construct dramatic scenes. He simply states that his mother, frightened, hid under the covers and lost consciousness. For him, that episode is significant not so much for the possible phenomenon itself, but for the mother's emotional reaction, the fear. Another element emerging is the difficulty of speaking about these moments calmly. They were not topics to discuss casually over dinner with friends, not episodes to share lightly at school. Fabio explains that for a long time he kept much of this information to himself, even with his closest friends. Not out of shame in the full sense of the word, but to avoid endless explanations or ironic reactions. Growing up in such a context means developing a dual narrative, an internal one, made of concrete episodes, and an external one, consisting of public versions, articles, debates. An interesting point in the interview concerns memory. Fabio admits that many memories only resurfaced in recent years, partly thanks to interviews or requests to recount events. It is as if some scenes remained archived, emerging only when someone asked the right question. This process of reconstruction is not linear. It is not a perfect chronology. It is a mosaic. And in that mosaic, the domestic episodes occupy a particular space. They are not documented in reports or photographs. They have no external witnesses. They exist only in family memory. It is precisely this private dimension that makes Fabio's account different from traditional ufological analyses. He does not focus on objective proof, but on subjective impact. At home, cosmic theories were not discussed. Anxiety was managed. The daily routine was maintained. Work, school, bills, obligations were attended to. And above all this, at irregular intervals, these moments of suspension erupted. The father stopping, listening to something no one else hears, and suddenly changing his behavior. For Fabio, these are the most concrete memories. Not the conferences, not the cameras, but the sudden interruptions of normality. And it is on these interruptions that the most difficult part of the story was built for him. In Fabio's account, if the father represents the visible center of the story, the mother is the silent axis. She is a constant presence in the interview, not as a secondary figure, but as a stabilizing element. Fabio repeats this multiple times, in different ways. If the family remained united, it was largely thanks to her. When the episodes that would bring the Zanfretta name to newspapers began in December 1978, the mother had chosen none of this. She had not sought exposure or visibility. She found herself within a story larger than herself and decided to stay. To stay means many things. It means witnessing the first nights of fear when her husband returned shaken from his shift. It means facing phone calls, the carabinieri, colleagues, journalists. It means coping with the regression hypnosis sessions that would follow, with psychologists and researchers trying to reconstruct what he claimed to have experienced. But it also means managing daily life, 2 small children, a home, a stability that was not guaranteed. Fabio recounts that his mother never publicly contradicted her husband. She never opposed him in front of others. This does not mean she did not have doubts or fears. It means she chose a specific stance to support. The card game episode on the bed, already mentioned, is one of the moments in which the mother emerges most strongly in the narrative. In the way Fabio reports this episode, there is no exaggeration, but respect. He does not use it to prove anything. He uses it to show what it meant to live alongside his father during these moments. The mother was not an external observer. She was directly involved. Another emerging aspect is the management of fear. Fabio says she often stayed awake when her husband went out at night. She did not always ask questions. She did not always demand detailed explanations. But the anxiety was evident. For a child, seeing one's mother repeatedly worried has a deep impact. It is not necessary to understand the exact reason. It is enough to perceive that something is out of control. Fabio also highlights the practical side of his mother's support. During periods of high media exposure, when the case was discussed on television or at conferences, she indirectly faced social consequences. Comments, looks, intrusive questions. Not everyone reacted respectfully. Some were persistently curious, others ironic. Being the wife of that alien guy is not a light label, especially in a provincial context where reputation matters. And yet, Fabio recounts, there was never a moment when she publicly distanced herself. This does not mean the situation within the couple was simple. Tensions existed. Fears were real. Misunderstandings too. But the choice to remain together was constant. An important point in the interview concerns the solidity of the family nucleus. Fabio does not describe a perfect family or one immune to conflict. He describes a family that withstood unusual external pressure. In many similar stories, he says, families break apart. In their case, it did not happen. The mother served as a filter. She protected the children from the harshest parts of the story. She tried to maintain normality in school and social life. Fabio, now an adult, recognizes that invisible work. There is a passage in the interview in which he states that, looking at the story as a whole, the strongest figure is probably her. Not because she experienced the episodes firsthand like her husband, but because she endured them without having chosen them. In the public account of the Zanfretta case, the mother rarely appears as a protagonist. She is often a background figure. In Fabio's interview, however, she becomes central, because it is in the family dimension that the impact of a story like this is truly measured. Not in conferences, not in books, but in the daily capacity to stay. Fabio states clearly in the interview, the surname Zanfretta has never been neutral. In some environments, it is immediately recognizable. In others, it requires explanation. But it rarely goes unnoticed. At school, As he grew up, reactions varied. Some were simply curious. Others asked questions with genuine interest. And then there were those who turned everything into a subject of irony. Fabio recounts that he developed a strategy to defuse the situation. If someone made a joke about aliens, he anticipated it. If someone asked whether spaceships landed at home, he responded with light sarcasm. Laughing before others do is a way to protect oneself. But this is only the surface. Beneath it remained a constant question: what really happened? Fabio does not claim to have a definitive answer. He does not present himself as a direct witness of the encounters. He does not say he saw spaceships or non-human beings. His position is more complex. On one hand, he acknowledges that the first phase of the case, between 1978 and 1980, was documented by colleagues, carabinieri, official reports, and even a judicial investigation. This was not just the story of an isolated man. There were other people involved. There were physical traces on the ground. There were multiple testimonies. On the other hand, he admits that the second phase, the continuous contacts, the mysterious box, the portals, is harder to place on an objective plane. This distinction is important because it shows that Fabio does not adopt a dogmatic stance. He does not say, "It's all true, period." Rather, he says, the first part has documentary consistency that cannot be dismissed lightly. The second is more complex. Over the years, he has read Rino Di Stefano's book, attended conferences, and participated in some alongside his father. On these occasions, he also observed the audience. Often, he recounts, his father was scheduled as the last speaker. This was not random. He was the name that drew the largest crowd. The hall would fill to hear him, and after his speech, many people would leave. Fabio interprets this dynamic as a sign of how polarizing the case was, and still is, but also as proof of how the name Zanfretta has been used to generate interest. He emphasizes that not everyone behaved opportunistically. There were serious people, attentive journalists, meticulous researchers. But there were also cases where, according to him, his father's name was exploited for visibility. This aspect contributed to a certain distrust toward the media. A significant passage in the interview concerns the relationship with those who present themselves as skeptics. Fabio does not say doubt is illegitimate. On the contrary, he considers critical analysis entirely legitimate. What he contests is the selective use of facts to support a predefined thesis. According to him, telling only the weakest parts of the story while ignoring the documented ones is not an honest approach. But, once again, his stance is not aggressive. It is a call for balance. Over time, Fabio also had to deal with his own professional and personal identity. He does not share specific details about his career, but implies that the surname can become a variable to manage. It is not easy to present oneself in a work context knowing that. By typing your surname into a search engine, dozens of articles about alien abductions appear. There is a dimension of permanent exposure, even after nearly 50 years. Another element that emerges is the direct relationship with his father in adulthood. Fabio admits it was never a completely confiding relationship on the subject. Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, he says, tells his story when he decides to tell it. He does not like being questioned insistently. This has left some questions unanswered. Fabio may have wanted to delve deeper, understand better, but he also learned to respect his father's character. For Fabio, this is a sign of personal credibility, not as objective proof, but as coherent behavior over time. Being the son of means moving between two poles, defending one's autonomy and respecting the family history. It is not about blindly adhering to a narrative. It is about living with it. And this coexistence, in Fabio's account, is the true red thread of his experience. At this point in the story, the question becomes inevitable, not the one asked by the curious, but the one that constantly returns in the interview. What does Fabio really think? Does he believe his father? Does he doubt? Is he undecided? His answer is never binary. Fabio does not present himself as a believer in the fideistic sense. He does not say, "I know it's all true," but he does not take the opposite stance either. He does not dismiss the story as fantasy or illness. His position stems from one concrete fact. He has lived alongside that man all his life. He states clearly that his father is not inclined to theatricality. He is not a man who loves the spotlight. He has never sought notoriety. If anything, media exposure created more problems than advantages. For Fabio, this is a key consideration. Then there is the factor of time. Almost 50 years have passed since 1978. In between, there have been enormous social changes, cultural evolutions, the internet, new waves of interest in UFOs. Yet his father's version, in fundamental lines, has remained stable. He has not added dramatic twists to stay relevant. He has not followed trends. He has not radically changed the narrative. For Fabio, this consistency over time is significant. There is a moment in the interview where he explains that, if his father had wanted to invent something, he could have constructed a more convenient story, less traumatic, less disturbing. Instead, the account is often harsh, full of fear, obligation, and coercion. It is not the story of a happy chosen one. It is the story of someone who would have preferred not to be involved. This detail, for Fabio, carries weight. This is perhaps the most evident difference compared to some more heated ufological narratives. Fabio does not seek adherence. He does not ask for faith. He recounts what he has seen and experienced indirectly. And then there is the human dimension. When he talks about his father today, he does not describe him as a case. He describes him as an elderly man who has endured decades of exposure, irony, accusations of falsity, and continues to live simply. Fabio seems more interested in the person than the phenomenon. There is a moment in the interview where he states that, above all, the most important thing is that his father remained true to himself, that he never sought financial or media shortcuts, that he never turned the story into a personal industry. This does not solve the mystery, but it shifts the focus. For Fabio, the question is not so much, do aliens exist? It is rather, who is my father? And the emerging answer is of a man who, whatever happened, lived his experience as real, not as invention. Fabio does not expect everyone to share this conclusion. He knows the case is divisive. He knows it provokes irony and skepticism. But in his current position, there is a form of maturity. He no longer seeks to defend or attack. He seeks to understand. And perhaps, in this choice not to exaggerate, lies the strongest point of his testimony. Not proof, not refutation, but coexistence with ambiguity. This concludes the first part of this interview. The second part will be in the next episode of The Italian Phenomenon. See you soon on Compelling Topics.